So good evening, everybody. This is, I think, really the first time I've talked about publicly about the copper mining work that Mike Eibel and I have done, along with Barbara Israel, up in Carroll County. And it's kind of we got to this a very strange way. I was out volunteering with the Archaeological Society of Maryland, looking at a site that we thought might be a quarry site for Native Americans to make stone tools, where they're quarrying pieces of quartzite. And I sort of told Mike about it at Smithsonian, and he couldn't make it that weekend. So he figured, well, he figured he'd go out on his own. I wasn't quite sure what he was talking about. But about a week later, I saw him, we were talking. He was talking about the quarry site, about these pits and all this other stuff. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And it turns out he misinterpreted me, and he wasn't looking at Native American sites. He was looking at a copper mining site up north of Eldersburg in Carroll County. And so that's how we got involved in this research, quite serendipitous. So anyway, I'm going to talk about this evening. Just a couple of things before we get going. If you look at the historiography, the study of what historians have been writing about in Maryland, a lot of it has really focused on agriculture, particularly tobacco and the plantation economy, wheat. And they've also talked a lot more recently about fishing and oysters in particular. There's some great literature on oysters, starting in the 1880s and certainly right on up to the present. And there's been a lot of historical work on transportation, particularly the canals and the railroads. Canals starting as early as, I think, 1803 for the Susquehanna Canal in Cecil County. So pretty early. Earlier than the Erie Canal, and the railroads and how they expanded very quickly through Maryland, earlier than most other parts of the country, and a general history of commerce. What is often overlooked is industry in Maryland. Maryland actually used to be a fairly industrial state, and I don't mean just Baltimore. Many of you are probably familiar with Ellicott City area, where we had cotton mills and flouring mills and all sorts of industry. But we actually had a mining industry, and it started pretty early. Iron mining and smelting in Maryland began in the 17th century. And it was a pretty big deal in the 18th through early 19th centuries in places like Laurel, up in Prince George's, Anne Arundel County area, along the Patapsco at Curtis Bay in Anne Arundel County, and up around Havre de Grace. But we're also getting other metals like lead, chromium, and copper. We also had a pretty decent textile and clothing manufacturing industry. I was surprised when we started working over on the Eastern Shore. For those of you who sat in on the shell button making talk, while we were doing that research into shell button making, which in and of itself was interesting, we found that there were quite a few cotton shirt factories on the Eastern Shore. And of course, brick making was a pretty big industry all throughout Maryland, more localized and more for local consumption, and hydraulic cement. Maryland was a leader in producing hydraulic cement. The C&O Canal was partially built with it in the 1830s, even though it didn't really become a popular building material until the 20th century. So anyway, just as a little bit of background. I grabbed some images off the internet to illustrate some things that don't relate very directly to the work we were doing up in Carroll County. But this is just a graph of copper production in the United States. And if you look at the far left-hand side around 1900, you see it's pretty low. You can only imagine that in the 1800s and the 1700s, it was even lower. It wouldn't even show up on this graph. It would be relatively negligible. And looking at the peaks and troughs, you could also, see, for instance, if you could see my cursor here, there's a trough there in the 1930s. Well, of course, that's the Great Depression. And then you see a rapid rise during World War II, a slight dip during the post-war recession, and then rising up again through the 1960s and 70s, a big expansion of the American economy, falling off again in the 1980s, one of our great recessions, and then shooting up with the big expansion in the 90s. Copper mining and manufacturing, it's like a lot of things in the economy. It comes and goes with the rises and falls in the economy. This is not Carroll County. This is the Bingham Canyon mine. I visited this years ago, like in the early 1980s. And at the time they said you could hide the Empire State Building in it. That's how deep it is. Big open pit mine. This is the way a lot of copper mining has occurred, mostly in the American Southwest and the upper Midwest. But it's one of two principal means of getting copper, the other being the old, dig a mine shaft, or dig these horizontal adits into the mountain. And in this case, this fellow is using a pneumatic drill to break loose the rock, which would then be carted out and crushed, and they'd sort it and try to extract copper from it. This picture is kind of interesting because the guy's using a candle for light. He's got this pneumatic hammer. This in 1909, pretty sophisticated technology, but his work is being lit with a candle. But this is the kind of shafts we're looking at in Carroll County. This sort of classical dig into the hillside or dig down from the surface into rock that requires relatively little shoring. Now, I started off saying, well, historians have largely overlooked industry. There is an exception, mining and industry in Maryland. There is an exception in this State of Maryland publication, the Maryland Geological Survey, in 1965. These folks, Alan Heil and Nancy Peer, did a very comprehensive study of metals mining in Maryland. Lots of images in it, lots of descriptions, lots of technical description. It's not bedtime reading. And it's available online. You could just search on Heil and Peer, and you'll find it. By the time the state printed this, however, Nancy Peer had actually published something for the general public in Maryland Historical Magazine based on their research. And so that's what you see on the right-hand side. That too you can also find online, or where any decent public library will have the full run of Maryland Historical Magazine. So the area we're talking about is up where it says schist, a type of stone. You can see my cursor at all. And there are actually three kind of linear areas where we get copper. And the base stone in which that copper is recovered varies as you go from west to east. So up near the Frederick County, the Carroll County, Frederick County line, it's schist and limestone. As you get to the area that we're going to talk about this evening, it's more schist, and these are metamorphosed. Schist is a metamorphosed stone made by sedimentary rock that's essentially been warped and restructured through immense pressure over long periods of time. And then further to the east, you got hornblende gneiss, which is a harder, denser stone in the Baltimore area. And if we look from the work that Heil and Peer had done, they'd actually created a map that shows where the basic, where the 16 copper mines were located. And you can see move those labels over from the previous map: schist and limestone, schist and gneiss. In western Carroll County, there's a linear formation. That's where copper was mined, and of a particular type. As you go over into what's called the Sykesville district, which is where the Mineral Hill mine is, and I'm going to talk about, that's just schist, and that's sort of in the middle. And then you get up in Baltimore County, not far from Towson, just north of the current city line, is where the Bear Hill district was. That was a major copper mining area just outside of Towson. So here's another one of their maps, and it's kind of primitive looking, to be sure. But you can see we've got 16 different mines that they've mapped. And again, you get, over in western Frederick County, near the Washington County line, you get a series of these things. Then a bunch over in Sykesville, eastern Carroll County, and then another bunch over, I'm sorry, I'm going to have the ball. Yeah, so I can see. So we have Towson, the one near Towson here, Bear Hills. We get the Sykesville arrangement here, and then we've got the those more in Frederick County to the far west. We have this one view, and this comes from the Maryland Historical Society. They use this on the cover of that publication by Nancy Peer. And this is a view of the Bear Hills copper mine from around 1870. It's an artist rendition, so it's probably somewhat romanticized. But a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, this is just one mining area of the 3 mining areas. And they had to deal with a certain kind of rock and were recovering a certain type of copper. And so how they were mining and smelting here isn't necessarily the same way they were doing it further west. Also, this is a snapshot in time. This is what the place looked like, sort of, around 1870. What did it look like before then? This particular area was mined back, I think, in the 1850s, and certainly on through the 1880s. So it very likely changed as they encountered new kind of rock, new market conditions, and new technologies. They drew this map of Bear Hills. And it's not an instrument map, it's sort of a sketch map. It's not highly precise, but for our purposes, that's okay. What we've done here is use the labels here to make up a list on the left-hand side of the kinds of buildings and features we might expect to find at a mining site. So a superintendent's house. These things are running, if not round the clock, certainly very long hours, 6 days a week. So the superintendent of the mine would have to live there. The miners would need some place to live. So we'd expect houses for both those groups. We'd want an office, for actually managing the various details of an operation like this. We'd need a blacksmith and carpenter shops. This is hard rock mining. These guys are using steel tools. They need to be sharpened and periodically repaired or replaced. So you'd need a blacksmith. You need carpenter shops to build the various buildings, various sorts of shoring if necessary, and other sorts of equipment. There'd be a steam boiler. It'd be sort of an engine room that would run the pumps, because you need water pumps to pump the water out of these things. And also for perhaps if they're using steel rollers to crush up the stone that came out of the quarry, out of the mine. And also other sorts of structures that, frankly, I don't know a lot about now because we haven't delved too far into the actual process of extracting copper from the stone. There's a lot of waste stone, relatively little copper. That stone has to be crushed up and washed and treated in certain ways to extract as much copper as possible. And then that material would then go on to a smelter where it would be melted, and the nasty stuff you don't need would be scooped off. the copper would flow out, as well as possibly other metals, lead in small amounts, and even gold and silver. And of course, we'd have shafts and drifts, a shaft being something that's more or less horizontal, a drift being an aided or sort of like a cave going in from the side of a mountain. And so those are two different ways of getting at veins of ore. And there'd be prospect pits, small pits dug just to look at the stone beneath and go, you know, is this worth digging here? Do we have a vein of copper right through here? And of course, roads, railroad tracks, if there's railroad service, etc. So from this nice little drawing here, not only do we have something to compare to other mining sites, this site no longer exists. I understand it's all been built over. It's part of suburbia now. But we do have some kind of map of it, and it provided a nice means of listing the kinds of things we might find on copper mining sites. So here's the guest of honor, the Mineral Hill Copper Mine. You can see it on the north side of what I suppose people still call Morgan Run, but this is really Liberty Lake Reservoir. This is owned by the city of Baltimore, even though it's in Carroll County. They own the property, they own the water rights. Liberty Dam was finished, I think, in 1956. So this is what the place looked like after 1956, or at least after completion of the dam. And if you know the area, that what we're talking about is Eldersburg in Carroll County. It's Route 97 goes right through it. And if you head north from Eldersburg up to Finkstown, which is just above top of the map, head up 97, you'll cross the reservoir, and you'll know you're crossing the reservoir. It's really quite obvious. And as soon as you cross it and drive a little bit further, there's actually a little pullout for your car. So you can actually park your car on the east side of the road, and you'll see a trailhead for a trail heading east. And you can walk that trail and get to this copper mine. It's on city property, although it's pretty close to some private property, so you want to be careful where you're going. And also because it's city property, there's no taking of artifacts. You can take pictures, you can leave footprints, that's it. The earliest maps we have, well, we don't really have early maps of the mine. This is one of the earlier ones, 1862. It's a map of Carroll County by Martinet Publishing Company out of Baltimore. And you can see where I put this big fat arrow, Mineral Hill, and below that copper mines. So it's actually mapped right above Morgan Run. And that's 1862. In 1873, the same company, Martinet, produced another map. And again, you can see Mineral Hill copper mines right above Morgan Run. And you might deduce from these maps that these were active mines, that there would be a little point in mapping them. And these guys did map a lot. They had certain landmarks like local churches and schools that they put on, but these aren't very detailed maps. If they put Mineral Hills copper mine on it, chances are it was active at the time. And we know it was in the 1860s through the 1880s. Here in 1906, in the U.S. Geological Survey map, you can see there's no label, there's no little symbol of crossed pickaxes or anything like that indicating an active mine. There's just two structures that are noted. So it's a little hard to figure out exactly what that means, but we're pretty sure in 1906, Mineral Hill copper mine was closed and had been for probably 15 years or more. But we're still, still collecting data, who knows. So getting back to this map here, it's important to realize that this is after 1856 when the dam was finished and Liberty Reservoir was created. So the water line has changed. The creek used to be a good deal further south of the mine, but now the water level has increased markedly up to the mine. We do have this 1864, as I recall, plat map of the area. And so on the left is the overall map, to the right is a detail. Neither one of them are oriented to the north. North is more to the left of the screen. So you can mentally adjust for that. If you can see my cursor, this is Morgan Run running through here at the base of the red polygon. So here's a blow up on the right, and I've put in text because the guy who made this map got terrible handwriting. And this red dot here, it says old shaft. This red dot down here, new shaft. And that suggests that, okay, this is in 1864, the new shaft area is what was then the active copper mine. Old shaft representing what folks regarded as the colonial period copper mine. The copper mine that existed sometime probably around 1750 up to around the Revolutionary War. Now, when Heil and Peer came along, they did another one of these sketch maps, and there's a few things to call out on this. The body of ore in this area is roughly 1,700 feet long, going sort of northeasterly, about 370 feet wide, 200 feet thick. At one time, there were as many as 100 people, I think, that worked there, although that was probably exceptional. And they were mining chalcopyrite as the kind of form of copper, and magnetite, a form of iron. So they're actually getting iron out of these things too. Again, iron smelting was a big industry in Maryland. And in a few parallel veins, I'm going to move, yeah, this one's better. I've enlarged the text here so you could say old or pre-revolution work, this up in the right-hand corner, old or pre-revolution workings, talc, schist, serpentine, and chloride schist. So those are the kinds of waste rock they saw on top of the tailings piles, the dumps, as they call them. Further to the southwest, you get the Maine or Tyson Mining Company workings. This was Isaac Tyson Jr., who had his hand all over copper mining in Maryland in the mid-18th century until his death, which I think was in mid-19th century, until around 1864. And this, I've also enlarged the text. It also is, chlorite, sericite, schist, and vein quartz in one area, chloride, amphibole, schist, and talc schist on a dump here. There are actually slightly different rock formations that they're hitting in this one mining area. And then if you can see, I can move this again. At the very bottom, it says flooded mouth of drainage aided. And this is the aided that they dug. I don't think it was it might have served as drainage too, but going in from the side of the hill in an area that's now, I think, underwater, under the reservoir, they dug on a slightly inclined plane up through the rock to mine copper vein. And so they've got some shafts up top, and they have this horizontal aided coming in from the south. Heil and Peer also mapped in these buildings, these dashed square things or buildings that existed at the time, and these other kind of oddly shaped things represent pits, test pits and whatnot that they noticed. For those of you who haven't used Lidar before, this is great technology. It's available online. If you need to learn how to find it, just you can get to me through Zoe, drop me an email, and I will send you the link. But Lidar is a way of looking at topography from high-flying aircraft or satellites. And it's created by emitting electromagnetic pulses of different frequencies to the Earth, and then measuring their response, their rebound. And it's a technique that allows us to basically go right through the trees. We could map the tops of forests, the forest canopy, or we can go down to the ground below. And that's what we've got here. So this is This is Liberty Reservoir down here at the bottom. Off to the left, the curving line is Maryland 97. And this sinuous line that runs along the coast of the reservoir, that's a trail that takes you to the mining site, which is this area. It looks like it's got a bad case of acne. And like I said, you can visit the site. You can hike up there. I got to tell you, though, this last leg of the trail is tough, especially if you're carrying equipment. It's quite steep. Not for the asthmatics among us. But here's a close-up of it. You see what we can get with the Lidar. You can see these are actually what it's showing are these topographic anomalies. These are all buildings and mine shafts. And up here, same thing. These are old pits from copper mining. And of course, the trail or road going through it. Because these things keep getting in my way from, let's see if I can move, there we go. At the bottom of this thing, you can see sort of a little hole. I think that's the mouth of the Adit, but in any case, there's like a little bit of a fan down there. And that's a tailings pile that runs into the reservoir. And then up around the middle of the screen, you'll see sort of a interesting shape right near the center. That also is a tailings pile. And I'll show you that. There we go. So here's a tailings pile that goes down into the reservoir. How far it extends out, we don't know. We haven't tried to map that yet, but probably quite a ways. And here's a tailings pile up at the top of the hill. It's pretty substantial. Give you another view of it. Here's two more views of it. It looks this way because I think, let me think, 1990s, it looked like from aerial photographs, the city of Baltimore went and bulldozed this area. Basically, they wanted to fill in the mine shaft. It was a safety issue, and this is effectively the city park. So this part of the site has been partially destroyed, a necessary thing for safety reasons, but it would have been nice to get a team in there to do some archaeology first before they went and did this, and maybe directed the demolition a little better. But it looks like it happened sometime after 1994, and it was done by 2000. Here's a nice picture of what this place looks like. When you look at it carefully, you could see these big holes in the landscape with trees growing out of them. This is the early part of the mining area. This is probably the pre-Revolutionary War copper mines. Off in the distance a little bit, center right is a house. The city property does come up to a number of private residences. So if you go up there, you don't really want to go much beyond where these pits are. It looks like we have, I think, the furthest north, the northernmost pit that we found is just on the edge of private property. Maybe it's on private property, I don't know. But at any rate, these are pretty big holes. They go into rock. These are some smaller ones along the base of as we're going down slope. So you can see. Now, we don't know how many of these are open pits for quarrying copper. We don't know if they're simply prospect pits to see if there's copper vein there that's filled in shafts that go down 200 feet. We don't know. And I'm not sure how we would figure it out either. Possibly using ground penetrating radar. Either that or, we get some old geezer like Dana Link out there with a shovel and just have him keep shoveling it out until he gets to the bottom. Here's a pretty good view of one of the larger pits. And again, we don't know what we're looking at here. Top of a shaft, it's probably too big to be a prospect pit. So they were mining copper here out of this pit, whether it was just an open pit or the beginnings of a deep shaft, we can't say right now. There's not much on the surface in terms of artifacts. Most of the artifacts we see, and they are few, are just casual trash in late 20th, early 21st centuries. the place looks like it was pretty well cleaned up or collected. There just isn't much to see on the surface in terms of artifacts. We do see structures, and again, if you can follow my mouse here, we've got a wall that runs through here, a wall that runs through here, and then back here is a relatively large rectangular building, a foundation of a building. In this case, made of dry laid stone. Doesn't look like any mortar was used. What was sitting on top of it? Some sort of building. What was the building made of? Well, I would bet these are log buildings rather than frame buildings. But the way to tell for sure is get out there with metal detectors with property owner permission, that is the city of Baltimore, and see if there are a lot of nails out there. If there are, then they're probably frame buildings. If there aren't, then there's a good chance they were log structures, even well into the 19th century. And this one's harder to see, but it runs across the bottom third corner of the screen, and there's some high ground over here. It's easier to see when you're actually out there, but it's definitely some sort of structure. And there's Mike Ivel standing around doing nothing. But here's one wall runs through here, one wall through here, and there are two others. You know, fairly distinct, especially when the foliage is down. And some of them are a little more substantial. They look like they have cellar holes. This is a sort of narrow area here. This is a bulkhead entranceway. This was a stairway down into the building from the exterior. Now, was this a dwelling, storage building, steam engine building? We don't know, nor will we until we actually do some archaeology here. Two images here. The one on the left is some sort of architectural features, you know, part of the foundation, so kind of a small area, with Mike's water bottle sitting in the middle of it for scale, and a tree having grown out of it. On the right, aside from our rock hammer, you'll see brick here. Brick is interesting because these foundations, they're made of fieldstone. They're made of the local stone or waste from the quarry, probably. But there's brick there too, and it's clustered. It's only in a few areas. Undoubtedly, it was for fireplaces or possibly even for a steam boiler, a steam engine. So where bricks occur on the site is going to be very interesting. Just a couple more views of interiors of these things. They're in pretty good shape. My guess is at some point the buildings were removed and the materials cannibalized for use elsewhere. But yeah, this is part of Carroll County where there's no dearth of stone, so they left the foundations. And here, give you some sense of the scale. I mean, Mike's not very tall, but still, this wall is above his head, so it's up around 6 foot deep. And we have a cross wall running across, so possibly different rooms in this cellar for different purposes. Maybe it's support a middle wall to support heavy machinery above. Again, we don't know. Most of any significant pieces of metal around here, machinery and whatnot, there's a pretty good chance it was hauled off and recycled somewhere, particularly during World War I and World War II. There are all kinds of drives for material that could be recycled and used for the war efforts. So that's why we've lost a lot of the iron artifacts that we might have found on sites like this, just like we lost a lot of railroad rails on abandoned rail lines. Those things were torn up and used for scrap metal. And just one more view here. We've got a pretty sizable, on the left, a pretty sizable foundation, again with the entranceway coming in. And this is, I think, mortar laid wall here. So they are using mortar in some cases. So what do we do with this? Well, we mapped, and I'll show you a couple of shots just to show you how we do this. It's been to one of my other talks. This actually is not Carroll County. This is Antietam Battlefield, I think. And that's the late Scott Lawrence with our total station. This is our mapping instrument. It's the same sort of thing you see surveyors use along the road all the time. And what he's done is he's set up on a point that we set in the ground, a steel spike. We set up another one a couple 100 feet away, call that our baseline, input the measurements into the machine. And that's what he's taking notes for. And then that machine sends a series of infrared pulses. I don't know how many per second. And aiming them, in this case, at Mike, who's holding a rod with a prism on top, and here's a prism here. And so the laser, the infrared, hits that lens, bounces back to the machine, and the machine, using the constant of the speed of light, can calculate the distance. It also has an internal measurement, so it knows what angle off that baseline it's shooting. And so the computer on that machine will actually give us the coordinates, the easting and the northing of whatever it is we're shooting. So anyway, we collect that measurement data, and we create a map like this. And I know it looks like I don't know, Andy Warhol or some drug-crazed artist created this. It's actually a topographic map. And the red lines, and these are 1 foot contours. So it's pretty steep topography off on the left here. We're going from 490 feet to 530 feet, and the scale is 150 feet. So over the course of about 150 feet, there's a drop in elevation here of 40 feet. That's pretty substantial. But the red, I've turned some of those contour lines, I've changed them from black to red. These are actually the pits that are out at the site. These are the prospect pits and the actual quarry pits. And those in the upper right-hand corner, again, seem to be those that date prior to the American Revolution. And we've got no buildings up there. We found no evidence of buildings, either because the buildings that we're using were down in this part of the site in the lower right-hand corner, or they were a sort of buildings that they just weren't using stone foundations, which seems unlikely. So again, down the southwestern corner, the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you can see more of these pits. A lot of them might be just prospect pits, but some of them could be the beginnings of shafts that go down 200, 300 feet. And the black polygons, let me do a close-up here. There we go. The black polygons represent buildings. We've got 6 buildings represented here, all different shapes and sizes, different levels of complexity. I think, I can't see my numbers here because it's blurred, but I think this building over here, the different parts, may well be a dwelling just based on its complexity. The others, who knows? We won't know until we do some archaeology on them. And there might be more buildings out there. They may not, they may be, well, it's unlikely that they're wooden posts set the ground because it hit bedrock pretty quickly. Maybe if we went in with some leaf blowers and just blew away all the leaves and cut away all the brush, we could see a little better and see if there are additional structures out there. But at this point, there are at least 6 building foundations that survive. You'll notice, go back up one, you notice the sort of linear aspect of these red ellipses. And these guys, this is essentially maps the vein of copper ore. These guys managed to target, doing these little prospect pits, find exactly where that the most copper might be found for the effort. And so it really follows a nice straight line across the site. The ridge here is wider. I mean, there's lots of places they could have dug, but they were clearly identifying copper vein. So where are we going from here? We'd love to be able to do some archaeological testing. In order to do so, we would have to secure a permit from the city of Baltimore, and we would do that in consultation with their historic preservation staff. I've already spoken with their archaeologist a couple of years ago when we did this work. She was enthusiastic about it. We would do some fairly small scale excavation units because we don't want to generate a lot of material that then has to be curated. And a lot of what we find may well be metal artifacts that require some conservation work. So we want to be able to date the buildings, which I suspect we do mostly through the kinds of nails we recover. The Revolutionary War stuff would be hand-wrought nails. Those from the Isaac Tyson Mining Company might be hand-wrought. We'd also see some machine-made nails, machine-cut and headed nails. And of course, ceramics, because these folks are living up there too, presumably. So we might find some artifacts that would help us date different parts of the sites and potentially even different buildings. And of course, we want to know what these buildings were used for, which were essentially domestic, for housing, and which were part of the industrial process. In doing so, we might figure out what parts of the process actually occurred there. It doesn't look like they were smelting copper. It doesn't look like they were building a furnace to melt the ore in. We know they had such a site a couple of miles away. And if memory serves, I think Mike might have found that just traipsing around the woods. But were they crushing the stone up there? Or were they just, sledgehammering it a little bit, loading it up into wagons and carting it a couple of miles to some place where they had more machinery? We don't know. Another part of this project is something that can happen at the same time or even before any archaeological testing, and that is, this is something Barbara Israel's been doing, is looking for other copper mining sites. And I'd love to hear about any sites that people know about that have been preserved. They're all almost certainly going to be on private property, so we would need to secure property owner permission. But I'd love us to get in there, find more of these sites, map them the same way, so there's some basis for comparison. Look at, are they using the same technologies? In the Revolutionary War period, copper mining at Mineral Hill, it looks like they were just open pits. And, that was that. What they were doing with the material, we don't know. Whereas in the 1850s to 1880s, in the southern end of the site, it looks like they were doing more shaft excavation and these horizontal drifts. And that means they might have been, using more sophisticated technologies too, rather than just hammering away with engineer hammers and picks and such. And what kinds of activities are present? What we're trying to get a sense of is the variability. We're looking at change. Does copper mining in this area change over the course of 100, 150 years? And if so, how and why? But at any one time, or different people doing different things? Because that could be very enlightening about, we start looking at capital investment, available technologies, the nature of the material that they have to bust through is suitable for some technologies, not for others. So we want to get some sense of the variability at any particular time. And then, of course, again, this could happen at any time, intensive archival research. What sources are out there? It's very likely that there are letters and diaries from the different periods of copper mining. It'd be great to get that kind of information. It's very limited in use, though. I mean, if some guy writes a letter from Mineral Hill, to a family member back in Baltimore or whatever, there might be some interesting details in there, but they don't tell the whole story, and they only tell part of that story for the particular time at which that letter was written. What's more useful generally, although a little more antiseptic, are quantitative data. census data. We know that there's quantitative data available from the US censuses. Most people are familiar with the population schedules of the census, where you do genealogy. It lists households and who's in that household, how old, age, sex, race, occupation, sometimes how much the value of their real estate, their personal estate. And there's other schedules for slaves from 1850 and 1860, you know, how many slaves and what were their names and ages for a particular year, for a particular household. And there are a couple of other different schedules, but the interesting one for us is the so-called manufacturing schedules. And that's where they actually looked at industrial sites and recorded how many people are working there, what was the cost, what kind of power did they use, if they were using steam engines, how many horsepower, what were they paying in wages, what was the cost of the raw materials, what was the value of the product. That's great information, but it's available for 1880 and maybe for 1870, maybe 50 and 60, I'm not sure. But there is some data in there to be had. There's also ledgers. We know Isaac Tyson kept a ledger. I think it's the Maryland Historical Society, and we haven't looked at that yet. That could be very enlightening. So there's lots of desktop research or archive research that can be done. There's mapping that can be done that doesn't require any digging and dealing with artifacts. And then there's actual archaeological testing, which would recover material that really begins to put some flesh on the bones of these mapped sites. So anyway, that's kind of where we are right now with the copper mining. Again, I'd love to hear about other sites, and particularly if you know who owns the property and about getting us access, that would be great.